So we've been talking about price controls, one way that the government may interfere with markets' ability to go to its natural equilibrium. And we've discussed price ceilings, a maximum price that's placed on a market through policy or law. Now let's turn to the flip side of that, the opposite of that, a price floor. So a price floor is a minimum legal price imposed in a market. Why does the government impose price floors? Well, with price ceilings, the point was to protect consumers, make it so consumers could afford whatever the product or service was. With price floors, the idea is to protect firms, protect the producer, and make it so that the producer can continue to produce a product that maybe otherwise they wouldn't be able to. So, like we did in the last video with price ceilings, let's think about unintended consequences that come along with price floors. So suppose that there's a $6 price floor on a container of milk. Pause the video and think about your answers to each of these questions. So will the quantity of milk for sale change? If milk costs $6 a container, then absolutely those dairy farmers and milk producers are going to do their absolute best to get a bunch of that stuff on the shelf. Because if you can make $6, then you want to supply a bunch so that you can make all that money. But consumers, on the other hand, are going to demand less, right? So quantity demanded will be lower. So yeah, there will be a surplus. There will be a lot of milk on the shelf. Will the size of a container change if the law were written such that just $6 per container of milk? Then sure, maybe manufacturers will provide a little bit larger container of milk to try to entice people to buy it, right? At that typical container of milk for $6, you might have trouble selling it, so you try to maybe differentiate, try to maybe get folks to come buy your milk by making your containers a little larger. Would a producer be willing to sell below the price floor? It wouldn't be their favorite thing to do, right? You'd like to get $6 for a container of milk, but think back to that first question. We've got full shelves of milk. Milk sitting on a shelf is milk that will go bad, and that's lost money, lost revenue for the producers. So yeah, the producers are probably likely to give illegal discounts. Maybe there will be a black market for milk where producers are selling it below the price floor just to be able to sell it, just to try to get rid of it, because inventory is not a good thing in terms of revenues. So are milk producers better off? No, not necessarily. Not if they have trouble selling what they produce. There's a lot of spoiled milk in this market. So with price floors, like we did in the previous video with price ceilings, let's think about three different situations: a non-binding price floor, a binding price floor, and the long-run effects of a price floor. So first, a non-binding price floor. What would happen in the market, this market for milk, where the equilibrium price is $3, if the government imposed a price floor of $2? The answer is nothing would happen. So with a price floor, any price below that floor is prohibited, it's the red zone, and a price above that floor is allowed, it's the green zone. And so a price floor of $2 in this case leaves the market price of $3 in the green zone. And the market sort of shrugs its shoulders and says, well, I didn't want to go below $2, so this has no effect on me, right? So there's no effect of a price floor that's too low. You typically don't think about the floor in a room unless you had to climb into the room. If the floor is too high, if where the market wants to be is beneath the floor, if the current market equilibrium or the market equilibrium without any intervention is in the red zone once the floor is applied, then the market has a problem, right? Now the market's stubbing its toe trying to get into the room. And the problem that we see is that the quantity supplied is much greater than the quantity demanded at that given price. And we have a surplus exactly of this difference, right? The difference between this quantity and that quantity tells us how many gallons of milk or containers of milk are left on the shelf. And if they can, just to try to sell the milk before it goes bad, we may see a black market develop. What would be the black market price for a gallon of milk under this price floor? Well, think about it. How many gallons of milk are on the shelf? That's decided by the supplier, right? The supplier has brought this many gallons of milk, QS, gallons of milk, to the shelf. When there are that many gallons of milk available, what are people willing to pay for milk? Willingness to pay is given by the demand curve. So with this quantity available, the price people are willing to pay is way down here at $2. So we've in fact reduced the price of milk if you consider the black market that will likely develop under this price floor. In the long run, a binding price floor just sees the situation get worse. So the surplus expands when those supply and demand curves flatten out. Given more time, people become more elastic. Supply and demand flatten out in the long run compared to the short run, and the surplus expands. And we still see a black market. So where do we see price floors in the real world? One very common example of a price floor is a minimum wage. It's a minimum on the price that firms can pay or must pay for work, for labor. This is the labor market, right? So the lowest hourly wage rate that firms may legally pay their workers. The rationale for minimum wage is we want to provide people with a living wage. We want people who are working to be able to survive with what they're paid, right? We want to help the working poor who are often unskilled to gain skills and gain experience so that hopefully they can move out of a minimum wage job. So a little review or overview of a labor market so that we can look at this on a graph and be on the same page. So in the market for labor, things are a little different than they are in a market for goods and services. In a market for goods and services, the households are the demanders and the firms are the suppliers, right? When we're talking about labor, then the households supply the labor. The people from the homes are the ones who go to work and supply labor, and the firms are the ones who demand that labor. Other than that switch, the demand curve is still downward sloping. The supply curve is still upward sloping. You'll notice here's a graph of a labor market. You'll notice a couple of other things change. So quantity is either number of workers or hours worked sometimes in these graphs, and price is wage, right? The wage is just another word for the price of labor, the hourly price of labor. So keep in mind here, the suppliers of labor are the folks, and the demanders of labor are the firms, right? So that with those sort of shifts in terminology and labeling of the graph, everything else works the same as you're used to with a supply and demand graph. So here in this market for labor, the market wage is $7 an hour. What happens if the government imposes a minimum wage of $10? So now the market wage is in the red zone, right? The result is the quantity supplied of labor is much higher than quantity demanded of labor. We've got a lot more people who want jobs, who want to supply labor, than people who want to hire. What do we call that? It's unemployment, right? We'd call that a surplus in a goods and services market, In this case, it's a surplus of laborers, which has another name, which is unemployment. What happens in the long run under this minimum wage? When supply and demand flatten out, it just gets worse, right? In the long run, unemployment is even larger. And if you think about black markets, you may start to see even lower wages paid under the table in these cases. So theoretically, a minimum wage that is higher than the market wage will cause unemployment. It causes unemployment because there's a decrease in quantity demanded of labor and an increase in quantity supplied of labor. Also, when labor is so expensive, firms may replace low-skilled jobs with capital. You start to use machines to do the work instead of people because you don't have to pay a wage to a machine. Right? So, causes of unemployment. We also may see shortening of hours for workers, right? So maybe you don't fully lay off a worker, but you give them fewer hours. Or firms may end up relocating. If there's a minimum wage, say in one country but not another, you may locate to another country where labor is cheaper. This is why those who advocate for minimum wage laws usually must include with those policies some element for training, education, job programs that helps to move people out of minimum wage jobs, that helps to get those people who may be unemployed more likely to be employed, more employable. These are things, training, education, job programs, these are things that would increase demand for labor if the labor is more skilled and could increase the market wage maybe closer to that minimum wage. What happens if minimum wage is below the market equilibrium wage? So if we have something like this, a non-binding minimum wage, you may see, you may hear of minimum wages being raised, say in this picture, from $7 to $9. Why would a government official, why would a politician advocate for that? Why would the government impose a non-binding minimum wage? The answer is probably in politics, right? If you impose a non-binding minimum wage, then the result is that nothing changes in the market, but maybe you'll look good to voters. You look like you cared. You look like you advocated for increasing a minimum wage. So that's a pretty easy political move, to move the minimum wage up, but not up far enough, or not up so far that it's above the market wage.